Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to resume our To-Do application demo from the second episode. And we're going to focus on completing this so that we can add items and edit and delete items as well. So for this, we're going to cover three main concepts. We're going to cover modal view controllers, custom delegates and protocols, and advanced UI table view techniques. Now this is going to be a pretty in-depth one, so if you need to, pause the screencast so that you can really grasp the concepts. Okay, so here we are in Xcode, and we've opened up our TekPub to-do project from before, and let's go ahead and run it so we can see where we left off. We can see we have a table view based application here. We have these rows here which you can select, and it'll add an accessory check mark onto the right. And we have a bar button item here with a system icon of plus so that we can add items, but of course it doesn't do anything. We have already wired up that method with this button to an action on our view controller, and so we can see that it's actually being called in our log here in the debugger console. And so let's go ahead and write the behavior to add new to-dos. So that brings up an interesting dilemma in that we want to add a new view controller. So how do we manage multiple view controllers? There's a bunch of different ways to do this, and one of those is with a navigation controller. And that might actually make sense in this case, except that a navigation controller is actually a little bit complex, and I'd like to reserve that topic for a later screencast. So we're going to use what's called a modal view controller. And we can look at an example of this when editing data using the contacts application. So let's go ahead and launch that in the simulator. See, we have the same pattern here for the plus button, and when you tap it, a view controller or a view slides in from the bottom up to the top, and this screen will be active until you hit either cancel or done. So we're going to copy this pattern. We're also going to copy this style of UI for editing, and we'll look at why in just a minute. So let's go ahead and implement this. We need a new view controller. So we'll right click here on classes, hit add new file. We will pick the UI view controller subclass and tick the with XIB for user interface option, and we're going to call this To-Do editor controller. Now we have our To-Do editor controller. We have a header, an implementation file, and our nib file here. Xcode, for some reason, likes to clump them all three together, so I'm going to drag this down over here into resources where it belongs. Okay, so let's open it up in Interface Builder. And you'll see that we have a blank view here. We're going to add you might be tempted actually to add a toolbar, since we're just going to be adding buttons to it, but the toolbar is really meant for the bottom, and you can tell because there's a line here at the top, and it looks a certain way when it's at the bottom. When you add it to the top, it looks completely different, and there's this weird dark edge at the top, and it's really not meant to be at the top. So we're going to use a navigation bar which has the flip design. We'll call this To-Do editor, and we'll add a couple of bar button items, one to the left side and one to the right side. Now there's a system icon. Let's go over to the attributes inspector, and we'll pick the identifier for cancel. And for the button on the right, we will use the identifier for save. And notice how it changes it to blue. Now for our actual dialog here, for editing the to-do, we could have a label and a text field, but in general that's going to look pretty ugly, and you won't find too many iPhone applications that look like this, and the quality standards have been set pretty high, and you don't want to try and get away with something that looks this ugly. So let's go ahead and copy that nice UI that we saw on the contacts application when adding a contact, and they actually use the table view for that. So let's go ahead and add our table view here. We're going to change the style to grouped to give it the nice pinstriped background, and we're going to repurpose these section headers and footers to give us some context, and just use the cell as a text box. So let's go ahead and save that. Now over here we do need to hook up the table views data source and delegate outlets. So let's go ahead and do that right now. we're going to control drag from table view to files owner and pick data source. And again, the same thing to pick delegate. And so we're assigning the data source and the delegate of the table view to our to-do editor controller. Now let's make sure and save it. Pop back into Xcode. Now our to-do editor controller must implement those two protocol methods. So let's go ahead and signify that right now. UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. A really quick way of grabbing the required fields, the required methods that we need to implement is to hold down Command and double click on a symbol, which will take us to that header file. So we're going to first look at the data source. And we need a couple of methods from here. We need this one and that one. And we're also going to use this title for header and section in just a minute, but let's start off with these two because these are the two required ones. So let's copy those. We're going to pop back over to our to-do editor controller and go into the implementation, and I'm going to create a section here. And if you don't remember what these pragma statements do, it's just a nice way of organizing your code so that when you hit this pull down menu right here, we actually have sectioned off areas where we can group methods together. Okay, we can get rid of these comments, and let's go ahead and implement this. So the first one is the number of rows in our table view, and ours is just always going to return 1 since we only have one field that we're going to edit, which will be the text of the to-do. The next one is actually returning a cell. So let's go ahead and create a UI table view cell. And with cells, we always use this initializer here, init with style, and we'll give it a cell style of default. And the reuse identifier, we actually don't need to use that because since we only have one cell, there's no reason to take advantage of the reuse queue. And we're just going to return it blank like that. Okay, so next, now that we have our table view wired up and we should see a simple blank cell, we need to wire up this view controller to actually be called upon when the user hits that plus button in the upper right hand corner. So let's pop back into our other view controller, and we're going to look for the add button pushed method. And right inside of here, we're going to create our view controller and present it modally. To do that, we need a reference to it at the top. So we're going to import the header file, to-do editor controller.h. Then we can get rid of this log statement for now and create our to-do editor controller. Now in this case, since we're creating the view controller and we do want it to load the contents from the nib that we created, we have to use this initializer, init with nib name. And the nib name is the same as the name of the class, minus the extension, the XIB extension. And 99% of the time on iPhone projects, that bundle property or bundle parameter is going to be nil, which means the current or main bundle. Next, we need to present this view controller modally, and that's a method on the superclass called present modal view controller editor animated. Yes, and by saying yes for the animated property, it's actually going to animate from the bottom to the top. And since the view controller is now going to hang on to this, it's actually going to call retain on our to-do editor. In this method, we're actually done with that memory, so we can release it. Okay, let's run it and see what we've got. Now we hit the tap button and we get our new view controller sliding in up from the bottom. Now these buttons actually don't do anything yet, so let's go ahead and do that so that when you hit cancel or save, it actually goes away. Now to do that, we're going to use a similar pattern that we've actually used a couple times before, and that's the delegate pattern. So we need to create a protocol which contains a method, and that method is going to signify when this dialog is actually finished. So back in our to-do editor controller header file, we're going to add a new protocol here, and we're going to do it at the bottom. We'll create a protocol called Todo Editor Delegate, and there'll be one required method on here called Todo Editor did finish with result, and we'll pass in a boolean for whether or not it succeeded or not. So if they tap cancel, we'll send in no for this. If they tap save, we'll send in yes for this, so that the parent view controller can decide what to do. Next up, we actually need to have a reference to an instance variable of an object, and we don't know what the type of the object is going to be, so we use the ID, which is a pointer to any object. But we do want to make sure that they conform to our delegate protocol. And let's call that delegate. And we obviously want this to be set by the outside world, so we need to make a property for this. Now for properties, for delegates, you almost always want to use assign instead of retain here. And the reason is we have a parent-child relationship, and it really doesn't make sense for the parent to retain the child and the child to retain its parent, because you can get into a strange memory situation there. Since this is a child view controller that's going to be, its life cycle is completely maintained by the parent, we don't actually need to put retain here. Now that we have our delegate property identified, now in the implementation file we have to synthesize it. And we have one other change to make in the header file here. When we actually build this, we'll get a warning that an error that it couldn't find the protocol declaration for Todo Editor Delegate. And you'll say, but wait, it's right here. Well, one of the nature of the C-based languages and this compiler is that it is top down. It will start parsing this file from the top, and it gets to this point and gives up and says, I don't know what that is. One option we could do is to move the protocol declaration up above it. We'd also run into a problem there because we're using this Todo Editor controller pointer to send in the editor's instance to the delegate that's handling it. And so this hadn't been defined. This would not have been defined if we had done that above this. So we have a sort of chicken and egg problem, and the way we get around that is by using a forward hint. We can just say, hey, compiler, there is a protocol called Todo Editor Delegate, but the body will be defined later, and that will pacify the compiler and get it to work the way we expect. Next, we want to go back to our parent view controller, and when you create this editor, we actually need to set that delegate property. So we're going to say editor.delegate equals self. Now that's going to cause another compiler warning because self does not implement that protocol. So let's pop over to the header file and we'll add the protocol here. In order to do that, we need to import the Todo Editor Controller.h header file. And we'll implement this Todo Editor Delegate. Let me jump over to that so we can copy this method signature. And we will jump back over here and paste in the method that will be called. Now, I'm not going to worry about result for now. There will be some code that we'll write to handle the proper save, but I'll write that in a minute. After we're done, we actually need to dismiss the modal view controller, which will actually release its copy or release its hold on the editor controller instance, and at that point the retain count will be 0 and it will become deallocated. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure that we can dismiss this view controller. So we hit the plus button and we hit the cancel button, and nothing happened. And nothing happened because we actually didn't hook these buttons up to anything. They don't actually do anything yet. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go into our Todo Editor Controller header file, and we're going to add 2 methods, and we're going to make them IB actions, one called save and one called cancel. And since we've marked them as IB action, Interface Builder will pick them up and we can make a connection to those. So let's go ahead and paste those in here. And the implementation of these methods are going to be very similar. If the delegate is not nil, then we'll call the method on the delegate. Delegate to do editor self did finish with result yes for save, and we'll copy this exact thing for cancel, and we'll return no. Now we just need to hook up those methods to those buttons. So let's pop into interface builder for our to-do editor controller. Okay, so we have our, since it's pretty cramped here, we could click on this and then click on this, but it's actually hard to see our file's owner. If we do that, you can expand this and see your two buttons here, cancel and save. So we're going to actually control drag from the cancel button to file's owner and hook that cancel button up to the cancel method. We're going to do the same thing for save. Make sure you save it, and we will pop back into Xcode. At this point, those buttons should actually do something. Okay, now this time if we launch it, we should see our cancel button and our save button actually calling the method on the delegate, and the delegate dismissing the view controller, and it looks really nice. Okay, so next up is to polish this table view so that it actually looks like a form. Let's jump over to our to-do editor controller class, and in our table view data source and delegate methods, we're going to add a couple of things to this. The first thing we're going to add is a new method here, which returns in a string, starts with table view, and we can hit escape from here, and Xcode will actually show us, let me expand this a little bit so you can see it. Xcode will show us all of the methods that we could implement based on the delegates, based on the protocols that we say that we support. And we're looking for title for header and section. So notice how I started it with NSString star table view, and so I knew to match it. So then we say title for header and section. We want the title for this to just say text, and that's going to be the label for our field. And we're going to do a similar thing for the footer. Table view, hit escape, we'll do title for footer and section. Now again, if you're confused of what all these methods do, consult the documentation. It's actually quite good, and there's just a bunch of methods that you just implement them if you want to provide behavior for those. Okay, now we've said to enter a nice description. If we run this, we should see a much better looking table view. Okay, so it says text, please enter a nice description, and we can select this, which isn't really appropriate for our example. So let's fix that, and we're going to add a text field to that cell. So let's go ahead and add the text field to the cell. Now I do want to hang on to the text fields so that we can return the text of that to the parent view controller later on. So we need an instance variable for UI text field so that we can access it. Now here we're going to actually create it. Text field equals UI text field alloc init with frame. Now the frame, we could make that to be the same frame as our cell's content view. But that brings up an interesting point that we don't actually want the frame. For example, if the content view was offset by the cell, by say some left margin or top margin or something, in order to make room for another image or something, then we wouldn't actually want the frame, because the frame's origin is going to be in relation to its parent. So we would actually want the bounds, where the origin would be up at 0, 0 in the content view's coordinate system. Now that's actually a complicated topic, so let's jump over and look at a visual example of this. Now to understand view, frame, and bounds, it actually helps to look at a diagram. So every view has an origin in the upper left-hand corner, which is measured in coordinate system of its parent view. So the root view, since it occupies the entire screen, almost always has a origin of 0, 0. Now this same view has a width and a height of 300 and 400 pixels, and so its CG Rex frame would be 0, 0, 300, 400 for the
X, Y, width, and height parameters. Now every view also has a bounds property, which is the same frame but represented in its own coordinate system. So every view will have a view bounds where the upper left-hand origin point is 0, 0, since it's measured in its own coordinate system. So this will become more apparent since this outer rectangle has the exact same frame as it does bounds, since the origin is 0, 0 in both cases. But the inner rectangle, the purple one, the frame's origin is 100 by 100 because it's measured in the terms of its parent view, and its width and height are 20. The bounds would be 0, 0, 20, 20. So it makes more sense for subviews when you talk about bounds. Now the only time that bounds and frame won't actually have the same width and height is if you were to apply a transform to the view to rotate it, and at that point the frame is actually and that measures the actual pixels that the object is occupying, not what the pixels were before the transform. It's important to be aware of these concepts when designing your user interface, because sometimes when things animate or resize, they'll actually look slightly different.
Okay, so now that you understand view frame and view bounds, it should become apparent that we'll use bounds here. In some cases, view frame and bounds will be identical, but just in case that so that you're aware of the difference, it's actually more appropriate to use bounds in some cases. Next up, just so that we can see where this is being placed, we're going to set a background color to something atrocious so that it's obvious where it's being set. And finally, let's add this to the content view. And release it. Now, let's run it so that we can see where this text field is being placed. And we can see that it's actually covering up the entire area near the cell. And we tap it, and we have a little problem where it's actually up in the upper left-hand corner, which is going to look stupid. When we remove the purple, it's not going to be centered in the cell. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. We'll create a smaller rect, and we'll use a function called cgRectInset. So we'll start off with the content view bounds, and then we'll provide a delta x for how much to shrink. So this is actually a positive number of how much smaller it is in the x direction. So we'll use 25 there and 10 for the y direction. And now we'll pass in the frame there. We can now get rid of that purple color because you'll actually see that now it's centered appropriately. And that looks pretty good. Now we have one slight problem. If when we launch this, they tap in the outside, it'll just select the cell and it won't actually put the focus in our text field here. So let's fix that real quick. We're going to implement the table views didSelectRowAtIndex path method. didSelectRowAtIndex path, and if they selected the row, we're going to deselect it immediately. And don't worry about animation. And then we're going to actually set the focus onto our text field. Now there's, you might expect it to actually have a method on it called setFocus or something like that, but it's actually a little bit more confusing than that. There's a method called becomeFirstResponder. And to do that, we have to set a method on our text field, and you might expect it to be called setFocus or something like that, but it's actually a little bit more confusing than that. There's a method called becomeFirstResponder, which has its roots in the Cocoa Foundation on Mac programming, where first responder is the element that receives keyboard input on a form. In the iPhone, when you become first responder, it will actually bring up the virtual keyboard, and that's what we want. Now, if we run this, we should see that if we select in the outer area of that cell, it'll just deselect the cell and set the focus on our text field, which is exactly what we want. Next up, we want the return key to actually dismiss the keyboard. So let's implement this. To do that, we need the implement the delegate protocol for the text field. So here, when we create our text field, let's set the delegate to self. And we need to signify that we implement that delegate, UI text field delegate. And if we command double tap on that, we get our protocol definition. Now notice all of these are optional, and we want the one that will be called as soon as the return key is pressed. And look at that, the comment guides us to use this method here. Now this isn't necessarily just when the return key is pressed, but it's also whether or not it should do anything. In our case, return key shouldn't do anything except call this method, so we should be okay. So let's go ahead and paste that method signature here. And we don't need to return a meaningful value there, but we do need to tell the text field to resign first responder so that the keyboard goes away. Okay, you'll probably come across this warning a lot. Anytime you have a method that has the same name as an instance variable, things get a little bit confusing. So you can just change them there or adopt a convention on your instance variables where they all have underscores, for example. Okay, so next we will hit the plus button, we will hit the return button, and notice that the keyboard is going away and everything is looking nice. Okay, the last thing we need to do to enable adding items is to expose the text property so that the parent view controller can grab onto it. So on our to-do editor controller, we're going to add a property called text, and it's going to be read-only. And instead of synthesizing it, like we normally would do up here, we're actually going to manually return this as the text field text property so that the parent view controller can actually read the content of that text field. Okay, so now that we have exposed that value in our parent view controller, after it finishes, if it's saved, then we need to get a handle on that text. And then create a new to-do. And we can use the init with text initializer that we created last time. Next, we need to add this to-do to our to-do items collection. And once we've added it, we can release this copy. And finally, we need to tell the table view to reload the data. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a reference to the table view anywhere in here or in our instance variable. So let's go ahead and create one real quick. We'll use our IB outlet UI table view, and in order to avoid that conflict that I mentioned from earlier, let me put this in the front. I'm going to prefix this with an underscore. So now that we have saved that, we need to pop into Interface Builder. And we can drag from table view, from files owner over to table view. Looks like we may have a compile error here. We do. I need a semicolon. Okay, sometimes those things will sneak up. Notice how Interface Builder wasn't actually showing me what I expected it to. Now let's jump into Interface Builder, and we will control drag from files owner to table view and link it to the table view outlet. And make sure to save. Now we can be sure that this IB outlet will be set, and we'll jump into our code here, and we're going to call table view reload data. And that's going to force the table view to ask its data source for all of its data again. At this point, we should be able to add items. And we hit save, and notice our new item shows up down here. And if we type in a description here and hit cancel, it actually gets dismissed completely, and that text goes away. We hit save, and it works. And we can select these items just as before. Okay, so next up, we will add an edit button here to allow you to edit and delete these items using that same to-do editor that we created. So let's get started on that. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is pop into our TekPub to-do view controller .xib file in Interface Builder so that we can add that edit button. And from our toolbox, we will just pick the item, the bar button item down here at the bottom, bar button item, and we'll drag it in right there. Now let's go ahead and call this edit. Make sure you save it. And edit actually needs to call a method on this view controller. So let's go ahead and add a method to our header file of TekPub to do view controller.h, and we will add an IB action called edit. And all we actually need to do is edit it in the header file. Eventually we'll need to put it in the implementation file as well, but for Interface Builder to pay attention to it, it just needs to be in the header file. So now we can wire up this edit button to our view controller, and I'm just going to do it through this one window here since things are so cramped. So we control drag from the edit button to files owner, wire it up to edit, and save Interface Builder. Okay, now back in Xcode, we actually need to implement that method, so let's jump into our view controller implementation here, and we will go over here to our event handlers, and we will add this method implementation. Okay, so what do we want the edit button to do? We need to tell the table view that it's going to be in edit mode, and we actually want to use this button to toggle. So what I'm going to need is a Boolean variable to determine whether or not we're editing. And that will by default be no. And so what we're going to do is toggle it here. So we'll say editing equals not editing. And then we're going to set call a method on our table view, set editing, and we'll pass in that variable. And that actually accepts another parameter for animated, and we'll go ahead and say yes so that it'll animate it nicely. Okay, so now we have our edit button, and we click it, and notice how it adds an animation and adds these little red signs next to each row, and when you click on it, it automatically gives us a delete button, and it even took care of shrinking this label for us, which is pretty nice behavior. Okay, so if the user clicks on this and clicks this delete as a confirmation, it's actually going to handle the removing the row for us, but it does need to come out of the data source as well. So it's going to call a method on its data source to commit that editing style. And the editing style will be a style of delete, and we will handle that method so that we can remove the appropriate item from our array. The other case we want to handle is if the user selects the row. And if we select the row, we actually want to bring it over to the to-do editor controller and allow them to edit the text of this item. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do the delete first and the edit second. Okay, so I actually don't recall the method that is going to be called, so let's jump over and pop into the UI table view data source protocol reference in the header here, and we'll take a look at these, and this is the one I want. So we can read these comments. After a row has the minus or plus button invoked for the cell, the data source must commit the change. So that's our responsibility as the table view's data source. So let's copy that method header, and we'll jump back over here. And let's put this in our table view data source methods section down there at the bottom. Okay, so this method will be called when the user taps on the red circle and then taps on delete. And so the first thing we need to do is check the editing style and make sure it's a delete editing style. So editing style delete, table view cell, editing style delete. So we need to remove it from our array. So we'll say remove object at index, index path.row. And then we need to call on the table view delete rows at index paths, and we need to pass in an array of index paths. Now we only have one element in the array, so we can use a quick static method or class method on NSArray called array with object, which will only allow one item in the array. And we'll pass in that index path. And this, of course, will get auto-released, but it's only going to be used in that one call, so we don't need to worry about memory management for that specific case. Now we need a row animation, and this is going to control how the row is animated away. And there's bottom, fade, left, right. Let's try right and see what that looks like. And we'll build it, and we'll run it. Test out one of the deletions here. Notice how it slides off to the right and it looks really nice. Okay, so now we have deleting and we have adding. We now need editing. So let's go ahead and implement that next. Now the method did select row at index path. Let's add a log statement here. So that we can see when I bring up the console, Shift Command R, we can actually see this log. And when I select it, notice that it actually said did select row, and again there. But when I edit, it's doing the same thing. So it's actually selecting these, which we actually don't want. So what we need to do is check to see if we're editing. If we're editing, we're going to do something. Otherwise, we're going to do this default behavior. Of selecting and deselecting. One thing that trips me up a lot, just based on my background as a .NET developer, is I like to highlight a bunch of things and hit the tab button to indent them. But if you hit tab, it will actually erase them all. So what I have learned is you hit command and right curly brace to indent to the right, and left curly brace to indent to the left. So that will come in handy. Okay, so if we're editing, we then want to create a to-do editor controller. And we'll say init with nib name, again, just like before, just like this case down here. So we need to pass in to do editor controller. And for the bundle, again, we'll put nil. Then we need to set the delegate to self, just like before. But this time, we actually want to initialize this with some existing text. So let's go ahead and set that up. Editor dot, we can say default text equals, and in this case we actually need the to do. So let's pull out this one that's already grabbing the to do out of the array and move it up here so that we can use this to do. Now we can say editor dot default text equals to do dot text. Now of course default text doesn't work because it doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and add that. In our to-do editor controller, I'm going to introduce a new instance variable here called default text. Then I'm going to add a property. Again, non-atomic copy, which is sort of the standard for NS strings, and we'll call that default text as well. Over in an implementation file, let's synthesize it. so that it will generate the getter and setter for us. Default text. Now we have some default text that we can use when creating our text field. So let's go down to where our text field is created. Equals default text. So we'll check to see if that's not nil. If default text is not nil, then we'll set it. Okay, it builds and it succeeds. Let's try this out. One thing I did forget to do, and this is so common to do, in our TekPub To-Do view controller, I forgot to release the editor. Actually, I forgot to present the editor as a modal dialog as well, so we wouldn't have seen much going on there. Okay, so again, we'll say self present modal view controller editor animated, yes. One thing you'll notice is we do have a bit of duplication between this call and this call. So what we can do is add a method. We can extract a method that we use for both of those. Factoring. We hit the edit button, we hit take out the trash, and notice our to-do editor comes down here. Now we do have a problem though. If I edit it and hit save, it actually adds a new one instead of modifying the existing one. So what we actually need to do is have our main view controller keep track of which one is being edited, so that when it comes back from the delegate call, we can know either to add a new one or to edit the text of the old one. So before I proceed with that, let's extract the common functionality between this block of code and that block of code into its own method. What I'm going to do is use some of the primitive refactoring tools in Xcode. If you're used to Eclipse or ReSharper for Visual Studio, or even Visual Studio's basic refactorings, these aren't going to seem that great to you, but it is nice that they are included. So on the Edit menu, we'll pick Refactor after selecting the text, the block of code that we want to present to-do editor. And for the what to pass, we're going to pass it in a string for the text. And of course, like I said, it doesn't actually it's not quite as powerful as some refactoring tools that you are probably used to. But let's go ahead and apply this, and then I'll fix it after the fact. Okay, so instead of this to do, we actually want to pass in some text here, and a string star text for the default text. And then we can just change that to text. Okay, and it somehow screwed up my indentation. So again, don't get your hopes up with the refactoring tools. They're definitely not quite there yet. Okay, so now we can say present to-do editor for to-do.text, and for the second case down here, we can do the exact same thing, except we can say present editor to-do editor for nil. Okay, let's give ourselves one more run to make sure that we didn't break anything. We hit edit, and we hit take out the trash, and that works just fine. And we hit the plus button, and it creates a new one. And that's exactly what we want. Okay, next up, we need to check to see when the to-do editor did finish. We actually need to check inside this if result block to see if there was an existing to-do. If there's an existing to-do, then we don't actually want to create one. So let's create an instance variable for a to-do, and we'll call it last edited to-do. And in order to do that, we need to import it at the top, to-do.h. Okay, and when we start editing, which is in this case here, we're going to say last edited to-do equals to-do. And if we're not editing, when you hit the add button pushed, we actually need to nil that out so that it doesn't try to edit the previously edited to-do when you're trying to add a new one. Okay, then when it comes back, we can check right here, say if last edited to-do is nil, then we can do that. Otherwise, we just need to update the text of our to-do. So we can say last edited to-do text equal to text. Save and build, and let's make sure this one works. Okay, I hit edit, I hit the take out the trash, I update it, hit save, and it updates the original row. Then I hit the plus button to create a new one, hit save, and we get a new one. And let's edit this one as well. And we hit save, and it does edit the correct one. And let's go ahead and delete these two and hit edit. There we have it. Okay, so we did cover a ton of material in this screencast. We went over almost all of the methods that would be needed to create a fully editable UI table view. There's definitely more complexity there, so this is a concept that you want to go over and over again. You'll definitely want to practice working with editable UI table views, as there's plenty of ways to do them, and you can get creative with it. You can create headers and sections and footers and transparent views and custom cells, and the list goes on and on and on. But they are the heart of most data-driven iPhone applications, so you will have to get good at them.